Welcome to Distilled Wisdom's audiobook summaries, where we bring you in-depth one-hour book summaries of the best nonfiction books. Enjoy this episode.
Predictably Irrational, the hidden forces that shape our decisions. Welcome to this summary of Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. In the next hour, we are going to explore one of the most important questions about human behavior. Are we really as logical and rational as we think we are? The answer, as you will discover, is both surprising and enlightening. Dan Ariely is a behavioral economist who challenges the very foundation of traditional economic thinking. Standard economics assumes that we are rational creatures who make calculated decisions by carefully weighing all available options. But Ariely's research tells a very different story. Through a series of fascinating experiments, he shows that we are actually quite irrational. But here is the key insight. Our irrationality is not random. It follows clear, predictable patterns that we can understand and even overcome. What makes Ariely's perspective unique is his personal story. As a young man, he suffered a terrible accident. A magnesium flare explosion left 70% of his body covered with third-degree burns. During his long and painful recovery, he watched the nurses treat him based on faulty assumptions about pain. They were not bad people. They simply had wrong ideas about how pain works. This experience sparked his lifelong mission to understand the hidden biases that shape all of our decisions. Today, we are going to walk through 13 key concepts from his book. We will begin by exploring how we judge value through comparison rather than absolute terms. Throughout this journey, remember this central idea. Understanding our irrationality is the first step toward making better decisions. So let's begin. Chapter 1, The Truth About Relativity. Let's start with a fundamental principle that underlies much of our irrational behavior. It is called relativity. This might sound simple, but it has powerful implications for every decision you make. Here is the core insight. We rarely judge things based on their absolute value. Instead, we always compare options to other nearby options. We lack an internal measuring system that tells us what something is truly worth. This means our choices can be easily manipulated by the way options are presented to us. Let me share a famous experiment that demonstrates this perfectly. Dan Ariely showed MIT students a subscription offer from The Economist magazine. There were three options. First, an internet-only subscription for $59. Second, a print-only subscription for $125. Third, a print and web subscription, also for $125. When students saw all three options, 84 out of 100 chose the combined print and web package. Nobody chose the print-only option. That makes sense, right? Why would anyone choose print-only when they could get both print and web for the same price? But here's where it gets interesting. When Ariely removed that seemingly useless print-only option, something dramatic happened. Now 68 students chose the cheap internet-only option, and only 32 chose the combination deal. What changed? The actual value of the subscriptions stayed exactly the same, but by removing the print-only option, Ariely removed an easy comparison point. That middle option was a decoy. It made the combined package look like an obvious bargain. Without it, students had to compare two very different things, internet versus print and web, and many decided the internet-only option was good enough. This pattern shows up everywhere in our lives. Think about buying a house. Imagine you are choosing between a modern, contemporary house and two colonial-style houses. One of the colonial houses has a damaged roof. You will probably pick the colonial house with the good roof because it offers an easy comparison. But the contemporary house might actually be better for your needs. We avoid difficult comparisons and gravitate toward easy ones. There is also a darker side to relativity. It makes us miserable through constant social comparison. Ariely points out that when executive salaries became public knowledge in the United States, CEO pay skyrocketed. Why? Because executives started comparing themselves to each other, and the competition drove salaries higher and higher. Jealousy and envy spring from comparing our lives to the lives of others around us. So what have we learned in this first chapter? We make decisions based on relative comparisons, not absolute values. We prefer easy comparisons over difficult ones, and this tendency can be used to manipulate our choices. These insights set the foundation for everything else we will explore. Now that we understand how relativity shapes our choices, let's move to the next chapter where we will see how this creates lasting habits through a process called anchoring. Chapter 2: Anchoring and the Fallacy of Supply and Demand. Welcome to Chapter 2. In the previous chapter, we learned that we judge value through comparison rather than by any absolute standard. Now we are going to see how this principle creates powerful and long-lasting effects on our behavior through something called anchoring. Traditional economics tells us that prices are determined by supply and demand. Consumers know what they want, and producers know what it costs to make things. When these forces meet, we get market prices. But Dan Ariely shows that this model is deeply flawed. Our willingness to pay is not based on stable preferences. Instead, it is shaped by the first price we encounter, which acts as an anchor. Let me tell you a story. Salvador Asael was known as the Pearl King. In the 1970s, he faced a problem. He had Tahitian black pearls, but nobody wanted them. These pearls were considered worthless. So what did he do? He placed them in the windows of expensive jewelry stores in New York with outrageously high price tags. He paired them with diamonds and other luxury items. Suddenly, people saw these black pearls as valuable. The high price became an anchor in their minds. This is similar to a phenomenon in nature called imprinting. When baby geese hatch, they follow the first moving object they see, usually their mother. That first impression creates a lasting bond. Humans do something similar with prices. The first price we see for a new product imprints on our minds and influences all our future decisions about that product. Ariely tested this with a clever experiment. He asked MIT students to bid on various items like wine, chocolate, and computer equipment. But before they made their bids, he asked them to write down the last 2 digits of their social security numbers. This number was completely random and had nothing to do with the value of the items. Yet students with higher social security numbers consistently bid more money. The arbitrary number acted as an anchor. But here is where it gets more interesting. Ariely calls this phenomenon arbitrary coherence. The initial anchor might be random, but once it is set, our subsequent decisions become coherent relative to that anchor. If you paid $5 for a coffee at Starbucks once, you are likely to keep paying similar prices because you assume your first decision was based on solid reasoning. Ariely calls this self-herding. We look at our own past behavior and assume we must have had good reasons for it. This has huge implications for how markets really work. The traditional view says that consumer demand shapes prices, but Ariely's research suggests the opposite. Prices shape consumer demand. Think about the manufacturer's suggested retail price you see on products. That number is not neutral information. It is an anchor designed to influence how much you are willing to pay. Let's recap what we learned in this chapter. Our willingness to pay is not based on stable, rational preferences. Instead, it is heavily influenced by the first price we encounter. This arbitrary anchor then shapes all our future decisions in a coherent way. We even reinforce these arbitrary choices by repeating our own past behavior. This means that market prices don't just reflect demand, they actually create demand. In Chapter 1, we saw how we compare things relatively. In Chapter 2, we discovered how initial anchors shape those comparisons and create lasting patterns. Now let's explore a particularly powerful type of anchor, one that seems to short-circuit our rational thinking entirely. I am talking about the word free. Chapter 3, the overwhelming power of free. Let's move to Chapter 3. So far, we have learned that we judge value through comparison and that initial anchors shape our future decisions. Now we are going to examine one of the most powerful psychological triggers in human behavior. It is the concept of zero, or as we usually say, free. Standard economics assumes that we make decisions by calculating costs and benefits. If the benefit outweighs the cost, we take action. If not, we pass. In this model, reducing the price of 2 items by the same amount should have no effect on our relative preference between them. But Dan Ariely shows that when one of those prices drops to 0, something dramatic happens to our thinking. Let me share the chocolate experiment that proves this point. Ariely offered people a choice between two treats. Option 1 was a high-quality Lindt chocolate truffle for 15 cents. Option 2 was a standard Hershey's Kiss for 1 cent. When presented with these prices, 73% of people chose the superior Lindt truffle. This makes sense because the Lindt is better quality and the price difference is small. Now, Ariely reduced both prices by exactly 1 cent. The Lindt truffle was now 14 cents, and the Hershey's Kiss was free. Notice that the price difference between them remained the same. According to rational economic theory, this should not change anyone's preference. But that is not what happened. Behavior flipped dramatically. Now, 69% of people chose the free kiss. What explains this reversal? Ariely argues that zero is not just another price point. It is an emotional hot button. When something is free, we perceive it as having immensely more value than it really does. The reason is psychological. Every transaction normally has both an upside and a downside. But when something is free, we forget about the downside. There is no risk of loss, so we stop thinking critically. This effect appears in many real-world situations. Amazon discovered this with their shipping promotions. When they offered free shipping on orders above a certain amount, sales increased dramatically in every country except France. In France, shipping was priced at 1 franc, which is less than 20 cents. But it was not free. When Amazon changed the French shipping to zero cost, sales in France immediately matched the pattern in other countries. The power of free has important implications. Businesses use it to drive sales, sometimes leading us to buy things we don't really need. But the same principle can be used for social good. For example, free health screenings might attract people who would otherwise avoid preventive care because they fear finding out they have a problem. By making it free, we eliminate that fear of loss. Let's recap this chapter. We learned that zero is not just another number. It triggers an irrational emotional response that makes us overvalue free items. This happens because free things eliminate our fear of loss. A difference between 2 cents and 1 cent feels small, but the difference between 1 cent and zero feels enormous. This is one of the clearest examples of how our economic behavior does not follow rational patterns. In Chapter 1, we learned about relativity. In Chapter 2, we saw how arbitrary anchors shape our willingness to pay. In Chapter 3, we discovered the overwhelming power of zero. Now let's explore another fundamental force that shapes our behavior. It is the clash between two different worlds we live in simultaneously, the world of social relationships and the world of market transactions. Chapter 4, When Social Norms Collide with Market Norms. Welcome to Chapter 4. We have covered relativity, anchoring, and the power of free. Now we are going to explore a concept that affects every relationship in your life, from your family to your workplace. It is the distinction between social norms and market norms. Dan Ariely argues that we live in two different worlds at the same time. One world is governed by social norms. These are the unwritten rules of community, friendship, and reciprocity. The other world is governed by market norms. These are the clear, transactional rules where we exchange money for specific goods or services. Each world operates by different logic, and when they collide, the results can be disastrous. Let me give you a classic example. Imagine you are invited to Thanksgiving dinner at your mother-in-law's house. She prepares a wonderful meal. At the end of the evening, you pull out your wallet and say, "That was delicious. Here is $200 for your effort." What would happen? You would probably be thrown out of the house. Why? Because you just tried to convert a social interaction into a market transaction. You violated the social norm of family hospitality. Now let me share an experiment that demonstrates this principle scientifically. Ariely asked participants to drag circles on a computer screen. Some people were paid $5, some were paid 50 cents, and some were paid nothing at all. What were the results? The $5 group worked hard. The 50-cent group barely tried. But surprisingly, the unpaid group worked almost as hard as the highest paid group. Why did this happen? The people paid $5 were operating under market norms. They felt they were getting fair compensation, so they put in effort. The people paid 50 cents were also operating under market norms, but they felt insulted by the low payment, so they didn't try. But the unpaid group was operating under social norms. They felt they were doing a favor for the researchers, and social norms are powerful motivators. Here is the critical point. Once you replace a social norm with a market norm, it is very difficult to go back. Let me tell you about an Israeli daycare center. Parents were often late to pick up their children, which was frustrating for the staff. So the daycare introduced a fine for late pickups. They hoped this would solve the problem. But the opposite happened. Late pickups increased. Why? Before the fine, parents felt guilty about being late because they were violating a social contract with the caregivers. After the fine was introduced, parents saw it as a price for a service. They were now paying for extra childcare, so the guilt disappeared. When the daycare later removed the fine, the bad behavior continued. The social norm had been permanently damaged. This has important implications for businesses and for personal relationships. Companies often want the benefits of both worlds. They want employees to feel loyal and committed like family members, but they also want to pay them based on market principles. Ariely warns that this strategy rarely works. If you treat customers like family one moment and then treat them impersonally the next, they will feel betrayed. You cannot have it both ways. Let's recap this chapter. We live in two worlds, social norms and market norms. Social norms are based on community and reciprocity. Market norms are based on clear exchanges of money. When these worlds collide, social norms disappear and are difficult to restore. Money is often the most expensive way to motivate people because social norms can be more powerful and more effective. In Chapter 1, we learned about relativity. In Chapter 2, we saw anchoring. In Chapter 3, we discovered the power of free. In Chapter 4, we explored the clash between social and market norms. Now let's move to a chapter that reveals an even more fundamental challenge to the idea that we are rational beings. It is about how emotions, especially arousal, completely change our behavior. Chapter 5, The Two Selves We Don't Understand. Let's begin Chapter 5. We have explored how context shapes our decisions through relativity, anchoring, and social norms. Now we are going to discover something even more profound. We are not one consistent person. We are essentially two different people. There is our calm, rational self, and there is our emotional, aroused self. And here is the shocking part. We are terrible at predicting how our emotional self will behave. Standard economics assumes that we have stable preferences. Whether we are calm or emotional, we should want the same things and make the same choices. But Dan Ariely's research shows this is completely wrong. When we are in an emotional state, especially a state of arousal, we become different people. We are like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Let me describe a groundbreaking experiment Ariely conducted with male undergraduate students at Berkeley. The students answered questions about their sexual preferences and their willingness to engage in various behaviors. They answered these questions twice. First, they answered in a normal, calm state. Later, they answered the same questions while in a state of sexual arousal. The experimenters wanted to see if the students could predict how their preferences would change. The results were startling. When the students were aroused, their predicted desire to engage in unusual sexual activities was 72% higher than they had predicted when calm. Even more alarming, their predicted willingness to engage in immoral behaviors, like not using protection or being aggressive, was 136% higher. The students in their calm state had massively underestimated how much arousal would change their behavior. This finding has critical implications for decision-making in real life. When we are calm and rational, we make plans and set rules for ourselves. We decide we will always drive safely, always use protection, always resist temptation. But when emotions take over, that calm self disappears. The aroused self takes control and makes very different choices. The problem is that our calm self does not understand this. We think we will remain in control, but we will not. This applies to more than just sexual arousal. Think about anger. When you are calm, you might promise yourself you will never yell at your children. But when anger hits, you become a different person. Think about hunger. When you are full, you plan to eat healthy, but when you are starving, you will grab the nearest high-calorie food. Think about fear. When you are safe, you underestimate how panic will affect your judgment in a crisis. Ariely's point is that we systematically underpredict how much emotions will control our behavior. We believe we are always rational, but passion completely negates our self-control. Our superego, the part of our mind that enforces moral rules, gets overwhelmed by our emotional state. Let's recap what we learned. We are not one consistent person. We are two people, a cold, rational self and a hot, emotional self. We cannot accurately predict how our hot self will behave when we are in our cold state. This means that when we are calm, we need to build protections for our emotional self. We cannot rely on willpower alone when emotions take over. In Chapter 1, we learned about relativity. In Chapter 2, we saw anchoring. In Chapter 3, we explored the power of free. In Chapter 4, we examined social and market norms. In Chapter 5, we discovered our two selves and how emotions hijack our rationality. Now we will explore a specific problem that stems from this lack of self-control. It is the universal struggle with procrastination. Chapter 6, the battle between now and later. Welcome to Chapter 6. Let's quickly review what we have covered. We judge things relatively, we are influenced by arbitrary anchors, we overreact to free, we confuse social and market norms, and we become different people when emotional. Now we are going to tackle a problem that affects almost everyone: procrastination. Procrastination is what happens when we sacrifice our long-term goals for immediate gratification. We know what we should do, but we do something else instead. Standard economics assumes we can act in our own best interest, but if that were true, procrastination would not exist. Yet, it is everywhere. So how can we overcome this weakness? Dan Ariely designed an experiment with his MIT students to find out. He assigned 3 papers over a semester under 3 different conditions. The first class had complete flexibility. All 3 papers were due at the end of the semester. Students could work on them whenever they wanted. The second class could set their own 3 deadlines. Once they set these deadlines, the dates were binding and could not be changed. The third class had no choice. The professor set 3 firm deadlines, evenly spaced throughout the semester. What were the results? The class with dictated deadlines achieved the best grades. The class with complete flexibility performed the worst. And the students who set their own deadlines fell in the middle. They did better than the fully flexible group, but worse than the group with imposed deadlines. What does this tell us? First, it confirms that we have a problem with self-control. If we were perfectly rational, the flexible group should have performed just as well as the others. They had all the same time and resources, but they procrastinated. Second, it shows that we recognize our own weakness. The students who could set their own deadlines used this tool to help themselves. They knew they needed structure. Third, it reveals that even when we know we procrastinate, we cannot perfectly solve our own problem. The self-imposed deadlines helped, but they were not as effective as the externally imposed deadlines. Why did the students with self-imposed deadlines do worse than those with professor-imposed deadlines? Because they did not space out their deadlines optimally. Some students thought they could finish everything at the end. Others spread them out, but not ideally. We overestimate our future self-control. This principle applies far beyond academic papers. Think about saving for retirement. Our rational self knows we should save money every month, but our present self wants to spend money now. The solution is to create mechanisms that remove the temptation. One example is automatic deduction from your paycheck before you even see the money. Another example is requiring deposits when scheduling doctor appointments. If you skip the appointment, you lose the deposit. This aligns your immediate incentive with your long-term goal. Ariely even proposes a self-control credit card. This would be a card where you set your own rules. Maybe you allow yourself to spend only a certain amount on restaurants each month. Maybe you block purchases at certain stores. The card would help you enforce rules that your rational self wants, but your impulsive self might violate. Let's recap this chapter. Procrastination happens when we choose immediate gratification over long-term goals. We all struggle with this because we have weak self-control, but we can overcome this weakness by using tools that pre-commit us to better behavior. These tools work by aligning our immediate incentives with our long-term interests. Chapter 7. Why we love what we have. Let's start Chapter 7. We have covered many principles of irrational behavior so far. We compare things relatively. We get anchored by initial prices. We overreact to free. We confuse social and market worlds. Emotions hijack our rationality, and we struggle with self-control. Now we are going to examine a powerful bias that affects our sense of value. It is called the endowment effect. Let me tell you about an experiment involving Duke University basketball tickets. Getting tickets to Duke games is extremely difficult. Students camp out for weeks and enter a lottery. Some students win the right to buy tickets, others do not. Ariely asked both groups to name their price. He asked the winners what was the minimum price they would accept to sell their ticket. He asked the non-winners what was the maximum price they would pay to buy a ticket. Remember, both groups are Duke students who desperately want to see the games. They worked equally hard camping out and entering the lottery. The only difference is that one group won and one group lost. What were the results? The buyers were willing to pay an average of $170, but the sellers demanded an average of $2,400. That is more than 14 times higher. How can we explain this enormous gap? Ariely identifies 3 irrational quirks. First, we fall in love with what we already have. The moment we own something, it becomes special to us. Second, we focus on what we might lose rather than what we might gain. This is called loss aversion, and it is a powerful emotional force. Losing something we own feels worse than missing out on something we never had. Third, we assume others see the transaction from our perspective. Sellers think buyers should appreciate the ticket as much as they do. Buyers think sellers should be willing to accept a reasonable price. But the emotional engine behind all of this is loss aversion. We hate losing things more than we enjoy gaining things. This bias makes us overvalue whatever we possess. It also explains why it is so hard to let go of things we no longer need. We focus on the loss of giving them away rather than the benefit of having more space. This effect does not require actual ownership. It can happen even before we fully possess something. Ariely calls this virtual ownership. Think about bidding in an auction. The longer you bid, the more you feel like the item is already yours. When someone outbids you, it feels like a loss. So you bid higher to get back what feels like your property. This is why auctions can drive prices far above reasonable levels. There is also something called the IKEA effect. When you invest your own labor into creating or assembling something, you value it more highly. That bookshelf you built from an IKEA kit feels more valuable to you than an identical one someone else built, simply because you put effort into it. Let's recap this chapter. The endowment effect means we overvalue things we own. This happens because of 3 biases. We fall in love with our possessions, we fear loss more than we value gain, and we assume others share our perspective. The emotional core of this effect is loss aversion. This bias explains why negotiations are difficult, why we hold on to clutter, and why we overbid in auctions. In chapters 1 through 6, we learned how relativity, anchoring, free, social norms, emotions, and procrastination shape our choices. In chapter 7, we saw how ownership distorts our sense of value. Now let's look at another way we waste resources. It is our irrational need to keep all our options open, even when those options are worthless. Chapter 8. The Trap of Too Many Doors. Welcome to Chapter 8. Let's briefly review our journey. We learned about relativity, anchoring, the power of free, social versus market norms, emotional arousal, procrastination, and the endowment effect. Now we are going to explore a behavior that might seem puzzling at first. It is our compulsive need to keep options open, even when doing so hurts our main goals. There is a famous story from ancient China. A commander named Xiang Yu was leading his army into battle. When they landed on enemy territory, he did something shocking. He ordered his soldiers to burn their own ships. This left them with no option to retreat. They could only move forward. By eliminating options, he focused his army's energy and ultimately won the battle. We modern humans do the exact opposite. We work frantically to keep all our options available, even when those options distract us from our true objectives. Dan Ariely created a clever experiment to demonstrate this. He designed a computer game with 3 colored doors. Behind each door was a room where students could click to earn money. Each click paid a different amount. Students had a limited number of clicks, so they had to choose wisely to maximize their earnings. The twist was this: any door that was not visited would start to shrink. After a certain number of clicks, it would disappear forever. What did students do? They panicked. Instead of finding the best room and staying there to maximize earnings, they ran from room to room, desperately trying to keep all the doors open. They wasted clicks on rooms they knew paid less, just to prevent the doors from closing. On average, they earned about 15% less money than a control group that did not have shrinking doors. Ariely made the experiment even more extreme. He added a cost. Every time students switched rooms to keep a door open, they had to pay a small fee. Even with this clear penalty, students still ran around keeping worthless doors open. He even told some students directly which room paid the most. Still, they could not resist trying to save the other options. This irrational behavior shows up everywhere in real life. Think about students who cannot choose a major. They take classes in many different fields because they do not want to close any doors, but by not committing, they never develop deep expertise in anything. Think about people who stay in failing relationships because they cannot face the pain of closing that door. They waste years that could be spent finding a better partner. The psychological mechanism here is loss aversion again. We saw this in the last chapter with the endowment effect. Losing an option, even a bad option, feels painful, so we overinvest in keeping options alive. We would rather spread ourselves thin than face the finality of closing a door. What is the solution? We need to recognize that doors close whether we like it or not. Time and resources are limited. By trying to keep everything open, we end up achieving less. We need the courage to commit to the best options and let the others go. Let's recap this chapter. We have an irrational compulsion to keep our options open. This causes us to waste time and resources on low-value alternatives. We do this even when those options have a clear cost and even when we know they are inferior. The reason is that losing an option feels painful due to loss aversion. The solution is to commit to our best options and accept that other doors must close. In chapters 1 through 7, we explored relativity, anchoring, free social norms, emotions, procrastination, and the endowment effect. In Chapter 8, we learned about our compulsion to keep options open. Now we will explore another hidden force that shapes our reality. It is the power of expectations. Chapter 9, How Expectations Shape Reality. Let's begin Chapter 9. We have learned how context and psychology shape our choices in many ways. We compare relatively, we get anchored, we overvalue free, we mix up social and market norms, emotions override rationality, we procrastinate, we overvalue what we own, and we keep useless options open. Now we are going to see how our expectations do not just influence our opinions, they actually change our experiences at a fundamental level. Standard economics assumes we perceive reality objectively and then form opinions. But Dan Ariely shows that the relationship is reversed. Our expectations come first, and they shape what we perceive and feel. This is not just about reporting, it is about the actual experience itself. Let me describe the beer experiment. Ariely served students 2 types of beer. One was regular Budweiser, the other was Budweiser with a few drops of balsamic vinegar added. He called this mixture Might Brew. When students tasted both beers without any information, they preferred the MIT brew. The vinegar actually improved the taste. But then Ariely ran the experiment differently. This time, he told students before they tasted that one beer had vinegar in it. Now the results flipped. Students said the beer with vinegar was disgusting. The expectation of vinegar being bad ruined their experience. Here is the critical detail. Ariely ran a third version where he told students about the vinegar only after they had tasted both beers. In this case, knowing about the vinegar afterward did not change their preference. They still liked the MIT brew better. What does this tell us? When you know something might be unpleasant before you try it, that expectation changes the actual experience. It is not just that you report liking it less afterward. You genuinely experience it differently. Your brain processes the sensory information through the filter of your expectations. This principle explains many real-world phenomena. Think about the famous Pepsi challenge. In blind taste tests, people often prefer Pepsi, but when they know which cola they are drinking, Coca-Cola usually wins. Researchers using brain scanners found that seeing the Coke brand activates regions of the brain associated with memory and positive emotions. The brand expectation literally changes the taste experience. Expectations also affect our performance. There is a study where Asian American women took a math test. In one condition, the researchers reminded the women of their Asian identity before the test. In another condition, they reminded them of their gender identity. When primed with their Asian identity, the women performed better, presumably because of the stereotype that Asians excel at math. When primed with their gender identity, they performed worse, presumably because of the stereotype that women are weaker in math. The expectations triggered by these identities changed their actual performance. The lesson here is profound. We do not experience the world as it truly is. We experience the world filtered through our expectations. When we believe something will be good, it generally is good. When we think it will be bad, it generally is bad. Our minds get what they expect. Let's recap this chapter. Expectations shape our actual experiences, not just our reported opinions. When we know something might be unpleasant beforehand, we genuinely experience it as unpleasant. This applies to taste, performance, and many other aspects of life. Our beliefs create our reality in a very literal sense. In chapters 1 through 8, we explored many irrational biases. In chapter 9, we learned that expectations shape reality itself. Now we will look at one particularly powerful type of expectation. It is the expectation created by price. This brings us to the fascinating topic of the placebo effect. Chapter 10, When Price Becomes Medicine. Welcome to Chapter 10. Let's review briefly. We have learned that context shapes everything through relativity, anchoring, free offers, social norms, emotions, procrastination, ownership bias, option preservation, and expectations. Now we are going to examine how one specific type of expectation, the expectation created by price, can have real physical effects on our bodies. The placebo effect is well known in medicine. If you give someone a sugar pill and tell them it is powerful medicine, they often feel better. This is not just imagination. The placebo effect can produce real, measurable changes in the body. But here is the question. Does the price of the placebo matter? Dan Ariely's hypothesis was that price acts as a signal of quality. A more expensive medicine should create stronger expectations and therefore stronger placebo effects. To test this, he created a fake painkiller called Velladone RX. He told participants that this new drug reduces pain. Then he gave them electric shocks to establish a baseline pain level. After they took the pill, he shocked them again to see if they reported less pain. The key variable was price. For one group, the pill was described as expensive, costing $2.50. For another group, it was marked down to 10 cents. Both groups received the exact same pill, which was actually just vitamin C. What happened? When the pill was full price, almost all participants reported significant pain relief. When it was discounted, only about half reported relief. The pill was identical. The only difference was the price and the expectation that price created. The expensive pill generated stronger belief, which triggered a stronger placebo response. This shows that price is not just information about cost, it is a powerful cue that shapes our physical experience. Ariely ran a similar experiment with an energy drink called Sobe. Students solved puzzles after drinking Sobe. One group paid full price for the drink, another group got it at a discount. The results showed that students who paid full price solved more puzzles. The higher price created an expectation of better performance, and that expectation became reality. But here is an important ethical question. Should doctors use expensive placebos to help patients? After all, if higher prices lead to better outcomes, maybe we should embrace this. Ariely suggests that perhaps the better solution is to boost the placebo effect through other means. Doctors could spend more time with patients, create more impressive rituals around treatment, or emphasize their expertise. These strategies might generate strong expectations without the need for high prices. The broader insight is that our beliefs have real power. When we believe a treatment will work, our bodies often respond accordingly. This is not trickery or weakness. It is a fundamental feature of how our minds and bodies interact. Price is just one factor among many that shapes those beliefs. Let's recap this chapter. The placebo effect is real and powerful. It is driven by belief and expectation. Price influences the strength of the placebo effect because we associate higher prices with higher quality. When something costs more, we expect it to work better, and those expectations can produce actual physical changes. This demonstrates once again that our experiences are shaped by our minds, not just by objective reality. In chapters 1 through 9, we explored many forms of irrationality and learned that expectations shape our experiences. In chapter 10, we saw how price creates expectations that affect our physical responses. Now, we will shift to a different topic. It is about morality and honesty. In the next 2 chapters, we will explore why we cheat and what we can do about it. Chapter 11, The Psychology of Small Dishonesty. Let's begin chapter 11. We have explored many ways our behavior deviates from rational models. Now we will examine an uncomfortable topic, dishonesty. Why do people cheat? Standard economic models offer a simple answer. People weigh the benefits of cheating against the probability of getting caught and the severity of punishment. If the expected gain exceeds the expected cost, rational people should cheat. But Dan Ariely's research reveals a more complex and surprising picture. To test the rational model of crime, Ariely designed an experiment. Students took a multiple-choice test with 50 questions. Some students turned in their test sheets normally. These were the control group. Other students were given the opportunity to cheat. They transferred their answers from a worksheet to a bubble sheet that was already marked with the correct answers. Then they shredded their original worksheet, making it impossible to verify their actual performance. What happened? The students who could cheat claimed to solve an average of 3.6 more problems than the control group. This shows that people do cheat when given the chance. But here's what is interesting. They only cheated a little bit. They did not claim to solve all 50 problems correctly, which they easily could have done. Most people cheated by just a few questions. Now comes the critical test of the rational crime model. Ariely reduced the probability of getting caught to 0. He allowed students to shred not just their worksheet, but also their bubble sheet. They simply reported their score verbally and collected money with no paper trail whatsoever. According to the rational model, cheating should skyrocket in this condition. But it did not. The level of cheating remained the same. This proves that the simple cost-benefit calculation is wrong. People are not cheating as much as they can get away with. Instead, they seem to have an internal limit. They cheat just a little bit, enough to benefit, but not so much that it destroys their self-image as honest people. So if fear of punishment does not control cheating, what does? Ariely tested this with another experiment. Before students took a math test, he asked half of them to recall the 10 Commandments. He asked the other half to recall 10 books they had read in high school. Then both groups did the test with the opportunity to cheat. The result was striking. The group that recalled the 10 Commandments did not cheat at all. Their average score was 3 correct answers, the same as the group that could not cheat. The group that recalled books from high school cheated at normal levels. Simply being reminded of a moral benchmark completely eliminated dishonesty. This finding has important implications. It suggests that we all have an internal moral compass, but we can lose touch with it when we are focused on other things. When we are reminded of moral standards at the moment of temptation, our honesty improves dramatically. This works even for people who are not religious. The specific content of the moral code matters less than the act of recalling that such codes exist. Let's recap this chapter. People do cheat when given the opportunity, but not as much as the rational cost-benefit model predicts. Most people cheat just a little, not a lot. The threat of punishment has less effect than we might think, but moral reminders are highly effective. When we contemplate ethical benchmarks, our dishonesty drops significantly. In chapters 1 through 10, we explored irrationality in decision-making and perception. In chapter 11, we learned that dishonesty is not driven purely by rational calculation. Small moral reminders can eliminate cheating. Now, in chapter 12, we will explore one more factor that affects our honesty. It is our psychological distance from actual cash. Chapter 12, The Danger of Distance from Money. Welcome to Chapter 12, our final chapter on dishonesty. We have learned that people cheat a little when given the chance, that fear of punishment has limited effect, and that moral reminders work powerfully to reduce dishonesty. Now, we are going to examine a critical variable that makes cheating much easier. It is the distance between our actions and actual money. Dan Ariely started with an informal experiment. He placed 6 bottles of Coca-Cola in a shared refrigerator at MIT. 72 hours later, all 6 Cokes had disappeared. Then he put 6 $1 bills in the same refrigerator. 72 hours later, all $6 were still there. This is puzzling. A Coke and a dollar have similar value, yet people had no problem taking the Coke but would not take the cash. To investigate this formally, Ariely designed an experiment at an MIT cafeteria. Students solved math problems and reported how many they solved correctly. One group was paid directly in cash. Another group received tokens that they immediately exchanged for cash just 12 feet away. The tokens had no value except to be traded for money. Yet this tiny difference had a huge effect. The group paid in cash cheated by an average of 2.7 questions, but the group paid in tokens cheated by an average of 5.9 questions. That is more than double. By inserting one small step between the dishonest act and actual money, cheating more than doubled. Why does this happen? Ariely argues that non-monetary objects do not trigger the same moral alarm bells that cash does. When you take a Coke, it does not feel like stealing in the same visceral way that taking a dollar does. When you cheat for tokens, it does not feel as wrong as cheating for cash. This psychological distance anesthetizes our moral sense and makes dishonesty much easier. This finding has disturbing implications for our modern economy. So much of our financial life is conducted at a distance from actual cash. We use credit cards, stock options, expense accounts, and electronic transfers. These mechanisms make it psychologically easier to be dishonest. When a CEO receives stock options instead of a salary, the connection to real money feels abstract. When you submit an inflated expense report, it does not feel like stealing cash from your company. Ariely is not saying that everyone becomes a criminal in these situations. Remember, most people still cheat only a little. But the distance from cash makes that little bit of cheating easier and more common. This fuzziness in our financial systems may contribute to widespread, low-level dishonesty that adds up to huge costs for society. Let's recap this chapter. We find it much easier to cheat when our dishonesty involves non-cash items or when we are one step removed from actual money. The psychological distance anesthetizes our moral reactions. This is why we would take a Coke, but not a dollar. This is why cheating for tokens is easier than cheating for cash. This principle has huge implications for modern financial systems where most transactions do not involve physical currency. In chapters 1 through 10, we explored many forms of irrational behavior. In chapters 11 and 12, we learned about dishonesty. Most people cheat a little, moral reminders reduce cheating, and distance from cash makes cheating easier. Now we arrive at our final chapter, where we will tie all these concepts together and see what behavioral economics can teach us about finding free lunches in life. Chapter 13, Finding Free Lunches Through Understanding. Welcome to our final chapter. Let's take a moment to reflect on the journey we have taken. We started by learning that we judge value through relative comparisons. We saw how arbitrary anchors shape our future decisions. We discovered the overwhelming power of zero. We explored the clash between social norms and market norms. We learned that emotions create a second self that we cannot predict. We examined our struggles with procrastination and self-control. We saw how ownership distorts our sense of value and how we waste resources keeping useless options open. We learned that expectations shape our reality and that price affects our physical experiences. Finally, we investigated the psychology of dishonesty and learned that moral reminders and proximity to cash both affect our honesty. Dan Ariely ends his book with one final experiment that brings many of these themes together. He took people to a pub in North Carolina called the Carolina Brewery. He had them order beer. Some people ordered aloud in sequence, so each person heard what the previous person ordered. Other people wrote down their order privately on paper. What happened? When people ordered aloud, they were much more likely to order different beers from each other. They wanted to project an image of uniqueness and independence. But this pursuit of appearing unique often led them to choose beers they actually enjoyed less. When people ordered privately, they chose what they genuinely wanted without worrying about what others thought. This is a perfect example of social norms, which we learned about in Chapter 4, Overriding Rational Decision-Making. Instead of choosing the beer that would maximize their enjoyment, which is what market norms would suggest, people let their desire to appear unique dictate their choice. They ended up less happy because of it. This experiment captures the core message of the entire book. We are not the rational actors that traditional economics assumes we are. Our decisions are shaped by hidden psychological forces that we barely understand. But, and this is crucial, these irrational behaviors are not random. They are systematic and predictable. So what do we do with this knowledge? Ariely introduces the concept of free lunches from the perspective of behavioral economics. In traditional economics, there are no free lunches. Every choice has a cost. But in behavioral economics, free lunches exist everywhere. They are the opportunities to improve our lives by understanding and compensating for our psychological weaknesses. Think about the Save More Tomorrow program. This is a retirement savings plan that works by automatically increasing your savings rate whenever you get a raise. It takes advantage of what we learned about procrastination in Chapter 6 and loss aversion from Chapter 7. People procrastinate about saving. They also hate seeing their current paycheck go down, but they are much more willing to commit future raises to savings. The program bypasses both problems. It is a free lunch created by understanding psychology. There are potential free lunches everywhere. We could design credit cards that help us with self-control. We could structure choices to make the healthy option feel free. We could use moral reminders to reduce dishonesty in business. We could educate people about how anchors and relativity manipulate their decisions. All of these strategies create better outcomes without requiring more resources. They simply work with our psychology instead of against it. The key insight is this: if we understand the forces that shape our behavior, we can design tools and systems that help us make better decisions. We are pawns in a game whose forces we largely fail to comprehend. But once we begin to understand those forces, we can stop being pawns and start being players. Closing thoughts. We have reached the end of our journey through Predictably Irrational. Let's take one final moment to reflect on what we have learned. Human beings are not rational in the way traditional economics assumes. We are influenced by context, emotions, social pressures, and cognitive biases. But our irrationality follows patterns. We can study these patterns, understand them, and use that knowledge to improve our decision-making. The first step is simply awareness. When you understand that you are vulnerable to anchoring, you can question whether that initial price is really justified. When you know about the endowment effect, You can ask yourself whether you truly value something or whether you are just reluctant to give it up. When you recognize your two selves, you can make plans that protect your emotional self from making bad decisions. The second step is designing better systems. We cannot rely on willpower alone. We need tools that work with our psychology. Pre-commitment devices, automatic savings plans, moral reminders, and well-structured choices can all help us overcome our limitations. The final message is one of hope. Yes, we are irrational, but by understanding our irrationality, we can become wiser, make better choices, and create better lives for ourselves and for society. The hidden forces that shape our decisions are powerful, but they are not invisible. Once we see them, we can begin to change them. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Predictably Irrational. I hope you will carry these insights with you and use them to make better decisions in your own life. Remember, understanding yourself is the first step toward improving yourself, and that is a free lunch worth claiming.